Eloise Hartman bolted upright in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sound echoed across the Kansas prairie. It wasn't human. No person could make that terrible keening wail that seemed to rise from the earth itself. She grabbed the Winchester rifle from beside her bed and crept to the window, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. 7 Apache warriors knelt in a perfect circle around something in her front yard, and their heads bowed in what looked like mourning. Steam rose from whatever lay at the center of their circle, and in the pale moonlight, she could see dark stains spreading across the hard-packed earth. Blood. Fresh blood still warm enough to steam in the frigid air. Her first instinct was to fire a warning shot to scatter these intruders before they could harm her livestock or burn her buildings. But something in their posture stopped her, the careful reverence of their position, the absolute stillness of their forms. These weren't raiders. They were conducting some kind of ceremony. She eased the window open a crack, wincing as the hinges creaked. The sound seemed thunderous in the silence, but the warriors didn't move. Their voices rose in a low chant, words in a language she didn't understand, but that seemed to carry the weight of ancient sorrow. That's when she saw what lay at the center of their circle. It was a horse, or what remained of one. The animal had been gutted and torn apart with savage efficiency, its entrails spread in patterns that suggested ritual rather than random violence. But it wasn't the butchered horse that made her gasp. It was the brand on its flank still visible despite the carnage. The Double H brand, Matthew's brand. The mark he'd burned into every animal on their ranch before he'd vanished 9 years ago. Impossible, she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. That horse died years ago. But even as she spoke, she knew she was wrong. Somehow, impossibly, one of Matthew's horses had survived. And these Apache warriors had brought it to her door as an offering or a warning. The lead warrior, a man with silver threading through his black hair, looked up suddenly. His eyes met hers across the distance, and she saw something there that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Not hostility, but recognition. As if he'd been waiting for her to appear, he rose slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. The others remained kneeling, their chant continuing in low, rhythmic tones. He walked toward her house with the confident stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Mrs. Hartman. He called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. We need to talk. She should have fired, should have driven them off her land with threats and bullets the way any sensible frontier woman would have done. But something in his voice stopped her, a note of respect, of shared grief that spoke to a pain she'd carried for 9 years. What do you want? She called back, her rifle still trained on his chest. To tell you the truth about your husband, he replied. About how he died. About why he died. The words hit her like a physical blow. For 9 years, she'd believed Matthew had simply vanished during a blizzard, lost somewhere in the endless white wasteland that surrounded their ranch. The townspeople had eventually stopped searching, had accepted that the prairie had claimed another dreamer who'd ventured too far from safety. But this man, this Apache warrior, claimed to know the truth. And the ritualistic slaughter of Matthew's horse suggested that truth was darker than she'd ever imagined. You're lying, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Am I? He reached into his shirt and withdrew something that glinted in the moonlight. Then tell me how I came by this. Even from 50 yards away, she recognized the object in his hand. Matthew's wedding ring, the simple gold band she'd placed on his finger on their wedding day. The ring that should have been buried with him wherever his body lay. Her rifle wavered in her hands. Where did you get that? From Matthew Hartman himself, the warrior replied. On the day he died. The day your brother-in-law murdered him. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Jonah Hartman, Matthew's older brother, had been one of the most persistent searchers during the weeks following Matthew's disappearance. He'd ridden out every day, had organized search parties, had comforted her in her grief. But he'd also been the one to suggest that Matthew might have run off, might have abandoned his wife and his dreams for a new life somewhere else. He'd been the one to plant the seeds of doubt that had tormented her for 9 years. "You're lying," she said again. But the words came out as a whisper. "Your husband saved my life," the warrior continued. "Pulled me from a flash flood when I was too proud to ask for help. We talked for hours that night about this land, about you, about the dreams he had for your future together." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on her face. "He told me about the hidden gold, Mrs. Hartman, the nest egg he'd been saving to expand your ranch. He told me where it was hidden, and he made me promise to find you if anything happened to him." The mention of the gold made her legs weak. Only 3 people had known about Matthew's secret cache: herself, Matthew, and Jonah. If this Apache warrior knew about it, then he'd either been there when Matthew died or— "Jonah told you," she said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "Jonah killed Matthew for the gold. Jonah Hartman shot your husband in the back," the warrior confirmed. "Left him to die in the desert like a rabid dog. But Matthew lived long enough to tell me his story, long enough to make me promise to bring you the truth. The truth." After 9 years of uncertainty, of self-doubt, of wondering if her husband had simply grown tired of their life together, she was finally being offered the truth. But the price of that truth was the destruction of everything she'd believed about Matthew's disappearance. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Oh, justice," he replied simply. "For Matthew and for the 7 Apache families your brother-in-law murdered to cover his tracks." The second revelation hit her like a sledgehammer. 7 families. Dozens of innocent people killed to hide the murder of her husband. "That's impossible," she said. "Jonah's not a killer. Jonah Hartman is a butcher," the warrior replied. "And we're going to prove it." As if summoned by his words, the other 6 warriors rose from their positions around the slaughtered horse. In the growing light of dawn, she could see their faces more clearly: hard men with the scars of violence. But also something else. Something that looked like hope. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Thomas Nantai," he replied. "These are my brothers, bound not by blood, but by shared purpose. We are the last survivors of the massacre at Willow Creek, and we've been hunting Jonah Hartman for 9 years." The name meant nothing to her, but the weight of their purpose was clear. These men had traveled hundreds of miles, had risked everything to bring her the truth about her husband's death. They'd performed a ritual sacrifice of Matthew's horse, had announced their presence in the most dramatic way possible. They weren't just seeking justice. They were offering her a chance to be part of it. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since Matthew's disappearance, Eloise felt something like hope stirring in her chest. "Help us set a trap," he said. "Help us catch a killer." As the sun rose over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eloise Hartman made a decision that would change everything. She was no longer just a widow mourning her lost husband. She was a woman with a purpose, a woman with allies, a woman who was finally going to learn the truth about the man she'd loved. The blood of Matthew's horse had soaked into the earth of her ranch, marking the ground where justice would finally be served. And she was going to make sure that justice was as brutal and final as the crime that had demanded it. The Apache warriors had brought her more than just the truth about Matthew's death. They'd brought her the chance to become something she'd never imagined: a hunter of men, a seeker of vengeance, a woman who would stop at nothing to balance the scales of justice. It was a gift more precious than gold, more valuable than all the land in Kansas. And she was going to use it to destroy the man who'd stolen 9 years of her life. The trap was set 3 days later when the autumn wind carried the scent of rain across the prairie, and the sky threatened storms that could wash away evidence as easily as they could wash away blood. Eloise stood in her kitchen watching through the window as Thomas and his men prepared for what they all knew might be their final battle. They'd spent the last 3 days gathering intelligence, learning Jonah's habits, studying the layout of his ranch and the routines of his hired guns. What they discovered had sickened her. Jonah Hartman wasn't just a murderer. He was a businessman who'd built his empire on blood and deception. The gold he'd stolen from Matthew had been the foundation of a criminal enterprise that stretched across 3 territories. He'd used Apache raids as cover for his own attacks on wagon trains, and isolated ranches, had sold stolen cattle to army contractors, had murdered anyone who threatened to expose his operations. And he'd done it all while playing the role of a grieving brother, a man still searching for his missing sibling. "The bastard's been milking your grief for 9 years," Thomas had told her the night before. "Using your mourning as proof of his own innocence." Every time someone asked questions about Matthew's disappearance, he'd point to your suffering and say, "No man would do that to his own brother's widow." The manipulation was masterful in its cruelty. Jonah had turned her pain into his alibi, had used her tears as evidence of his own virtue. He'd visited her regularly, had brought her supplies, and offered comfort, all while knowing that he was the cause of her suffering. But that was about to end. The plan was simple in its brutality. Thomas and his men would approach Jonah's ranch under the cover of darkness, would take positions around the buildings, and would wait for Eloise to arrive. She would confront Jonah with the truth about Matthew's death, would demand the return of the stolen gold, and would force him to confess his crimes. If he refused, if he tried to deny his guilt, she would give the signal. And Thomas would kill him. It wasn't justice in the legal sense. There would be no trial, no judge, no jury. But it was justice in the way that mattered most to her. It was personal, and it was final. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked, appearing in her kitchen doorway. "Once we start, there's no going back." "I've been sure for 9 years," she replied. "I just didn't know what I was sure about." He nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. For 9 years she'd carried the burden of uncertainty, of wondering if her husband had abandoned her, of questioning her own worth as a woman and a wife. Now she knew the truth, and that knowledge had transformed her grief into something harder and more focused. Rage. Pure, clean rage that burned like a forge fire in her chest. "The others are ready," Thomas said. "We'll be in position by sunset." "What about afterward?" she asked. "What happens when it's over?" "That depends on you," he replied. "We can disappear back into the desert, leave you to explain things to the law, or we can stay. Help you build something better on this land. Something that honors Matthew's memory." The offer was unexpected, but not unwelcome. These men had risked everything to bring her the truth, had offered to help her achieve justice for her husband's murder. They weren't just allies, they were the closest thing to family she'd had in 9 years. "What would you build?" she asked. "A place where Apache and white can live in peace," Thomas said. "A place where children can grow up without fear, where families can prosper without persecution. A place worth fighting for." It was a beautiful dream, but she knew the reality would be far more complicated. The territorial government didn't look kindly on white settlers who harbored Apache families, and the local ranchers would see such an arrangement as a threat to their own security. "It won't be easy," she said. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Thomas replied. "But it's worth trying." As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Eloise Hartman prepared for the confrontation that would define the rest of her life. She dressed in her finest clothes, the black dress she'd worn to Matthew's memorial service, the pearl necklace he'd given her for their first anniversary, the wedding ring that had never left her finger despite 9 years of widowhood. She wanted to look like a woman who'd been wronged, a woman who deserved justice. But more than that, she wanted to look like a woman who was capable of taking that justice for herself. The ride to Jonah's ranch took 2 hours, long enough for her to think about what she was going to say, long enough to rehearse the confrontation in her mind. She'd imagined this moment countless times over the years, had dreamed of the day when she'd finally learn the truth about Matthew's disappearance. But she'd never imagined it would end in blood. Jonah's ranch house was a sprawling affair, built with the profits from 9 years of criminal enterprise. It was larger than her own modest home, more luxurious, filled with the kind of expensive furnishings that spoke of a man who'd never known want or uncertainty. Blood money, she thought, as she approached the front door. Every stick of furniture, every piece of silver, every comfortable luxury, all of it paid for with Matthew's gold and the lives of innocent people. She knocked on the door with the confidence of a woman who belonged there, who had every right to demand answers from her brother-in-law. When Jonah opened the door, his face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Eloise, what a surprise. Come in, come in. You look beautiful tonight." The easy charm, the familiar warmth, it was all exactly as she remembered. This was the man who'd comforted her in her grief, who'd helped her through the darkest period of her life. It was almost impossible to believe he was also the man who'd murdered her husband. Almost. "We need to talk, Jonah," she said, stepping into his parlor. "About Matthew." His smile faltered slightly, but recovered quickly. "Of course. You know I'm always ready to talk about Matthew. Have you remembered something new? Some detail that might help us understand what happened to him?" The performance was flawless. If she hadn't known the truth, she might have been fooled by his apparent concern, his willingness to discuss a painful subject. But she could see through the mask now, could see the calculation behind his eyes. "I know what happened to him," she said simply. The words hung in the air, like a death sentence. Jonah's face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, fear, and finally a cold assessment that chilled her to the bone. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I mean, I know you killed him," she said. "I know you shot him in the back and left him to die in the desert. I know you stole his gold and used it to build this empire of yours. And I know you murdered 7 Apache families to cover your tracks." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonah stood frozen in the middle of his parlor, his face a mask of shock and calculation. She could see him weighing his options, deciding whether to continue the charade or abandon it entirely. "And that's quite an accusation," he said finally. "Do you have any proof?" She reached into her purse and withdrew Matthew's wedding ring, holding it up so the lamplight caught the gold. "This is proof enough." Jonah's eyes fixed on the ring, and she saw something die in his face. The mask of concern, of brotherly affection, crumbled away to reveal the cold killer beneath. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "From the man who was with Matthew when he died," she replied. "The man who heard his confession, who promised to bring me the truth." "The Apache? His name is Thomas Nuntai, and he's been hunting you for 9 years. Jonah laughed, but the sound was bitter and without humor. "So you've thrown in with savages. I should have expected as much. You were always too soft, too willing to trust the wrong people." "The wrong people?" she asked. "You mean like you—" "I mean like Matthew," he snapped. "My brother was a dreamer, a fool who thought he could make peace with savages and still turn a profit. He was going to get you killed, Eloise. Get both of you killed with his naive ideas about cooperation and mutual respect. So you killed him first. I saved you," he said, his voice rising. "I saved you from a life of poverty and disappointment. Matthew's dreams would have ruined you both. And the gold did that save me too." Jonah's smile was cold and predatory. "The gold was wasted on Matthew. He would have spent it on more cattle, more land, more grandiose schemes that would have failed like all the others. I used it to build something that lasts, something that matters. Built on blood and murder. Built on hard choices," he corrected. "This is a hard country, Eloise. It demands hard decisions from hard people. Matthew was too soft to make those decisions. But I'm not." The admission was everything she'd needed to hear. Jonah had confessed to Matthew's murder, had justified it with the twisted logic of a man who'd convinced himself that his crimes were virtues. But she wasn't done yet. "What about the Apache families?" she asked. "What hard decision justified murdering children?" "They were witnesses," he said simply. "They saw me shoot Matthew, saw me take the gold. They had to be eliminated. All of them, even the children, especially the children. Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors. Better to kill them young than fight them later." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. This man, this monster, had murdered entire families to protect his secret. He'd killed children, had slaughtered innocents, and he spoke of it as if it were a business decision. "You're insane," she whispered. "I'm practical," he replied. "And I'm tired of pretending otherwise. You want to know the truth, Eloise. The truth is that Matthew was weak, and weakness gets people killed on the frontier. I did what needed to be done to protect what mattered." "Protect what your stolen gold?" "Mar, protect you," he said. "Protect the future we could build together. Matthew's dead, but you're alive. You're here in my house wearing his ring like a monument to failure. But it doesn't have to be that way." She stared at him, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "You think I'm here to accept your proposal? You think I'm here to become your wife, aren't you?" he asked. "You're a beautiful woman, Eloise. Too beautiful to waste your life mourning a dead dreamer. I can give you everything Matthew promised and more. Wealth, security, a position in society. All you have to do is forget about the past. Forget about justice. Forget about revenge," he corrected. "Justice is what the strong do to the weak. Revenge is what the weak dream about, but never achieve." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who'd stolen 9 years of her life. The man who'd turned her into a widow, who'd made her question her own worth, who'd used her grief as a tool to manipulate everyone around them. "You're wrong about one thing," she said quietly. "What's that?" "I'm not weak anymore." She raised her hand, and the signal was given. Through the windows of Jonah's parlor, she could see muzzle flashes erupting from the darkness. The Apache warriors had surrounded the house, had eliminated Jonah's guards, with the silent efficiency of natural predators. "What have you done?" Jonah asked, his face going pale. "I've brought you justice," she replied. "The kind of justice you understand. The kind that's personal." Thomas kicked in the front door, his rifle trained on Jonah's chest. Behind him came the other 6 warriors, moving with the coordinated precision of men who'd fought together for years. "Jonah Hartman," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of judgment. "You are guilty of murder, theft, and genocide. The penalty is death." "You can't do this," Jonah said, backing toward the far wall. "I have rights. This is America." "You forfeited your rights when you murdered children," Thomas replied. "And this is Apache justice." "Wait," Eloise said, stepping between them. "I want to hear him admit it, all of it. Every crime, every murder, every lie." Jonah's eyes darted between her and the Apache warriors, calculating his chances of survival. She could see him weighing his options, wondering if confession might somehow save his life. "Fine," he said finally. "You want the truth, I'll give you the truth. Yes, I killed Matthew. Yes, I stole his gold. Yes, I murdered the Apache families who witnessed it. And yes, I'd do it all again if I had to." "Why?" she asked. "Because I loved you," he said, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "I loved you from the moment Matthew brought you home, loved you through all the years of watching you waste yourself on a man who didn't deserve you. I killed him because I couldn't stand to see you throw your life away on his foolish dreams." The confession was more than she'd expected, more personal and more twisted than she'd imagined. Jonah hadn't just killed Matthew for gold, he'd killed him for her, had convinced himself that murder was an act of love. You destroyed my life, she said. I saved your life, he replied. And I'm still trying to save it. Kill me, and you'll have to explain my death to the territorial marshal. You'll be connected to my crimes, implicated in my murder. Is that what you want? It was a good point, she had to admit. Killing Jonah would solve the problem of his crimes, but it would create new problems for her. She'd be questioned, investigated, possibly charged as an accessory to murder. But she'd also be free. Free from the weight of uncertainty, free from the burden of wondering what had happened to her husband. Free to build a new life on the foundation of truth rather than lies. I'll take that risk, she said. Then you're as foolish as your husband was, Jonah replied. Thomas stepped forward, his rifle aimed at Jonah's heart. Any last words? Yes. Jonah said, his voice steady despite the situation. Tell her about the other gold. Tell her about the cash Matthew never found, the one he never knew about. Tell her about the real treasure of this land. What other gold? Eloise asked. The Spanish gold. Jonah said with a bitter smile. The treasure that's been hidden on this land for 200 years. The treasure that Matthew died trying to find, even though he never knew he was looking for it. The revelation hit her like a thunderbolt. Spanish gold hidden on her land for centuries. It explained so much why Jonah had been so interested in her property, why he'd been so eager to buy it from her, why he'd been willing to kill for it. Where, she asked. In the cave system beneath Willow Creek, Jonah said. The same caves where I hid the bodies of the Apache families. The same caves where I hid Matthew's body after I brought it back from the desert. The words were like daggers in her chest. Matthew's body hidden in a cave system she'd never known existed. The Apache families butchered and concealed in the same dark chambers. And underneath it all, a treasure that had been waiting for centuries to be discovered. You're lying, she said. Am I? Jonah asked. Then why do you think I've been so interested in your land? Why do you think I've spent 9 years trying to convince you to sell? It wasn't just about the gold Matthew had. It was about the gold he never found. Thomas looked at her, his dark eyes questioning. She could see him weighing the revelation, wondering if it changed anything about their mission. It doesn't matter, she said finally. Gold doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't undo the crimes you've committed. No. Jonah agreed. But it could make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. Rich enough to buy your own justice, your own security. Rich enough to build the kind of life Matthew always promised, but never delivered. Blood money, she said. All money is blood money, Jonah replied. The only question is whose blood paid for it. She looked at him, this man who destroyed her life, and now offered to make her rich. The offer was tempting in its simplicity. Take the gold, become wealthy, buy her way out of the consequences of justice. But she'd learned something important over the past few days. Some things were more valuable than gold. Some things were worth more than money. Kill him, she said. Thomas's rifle cracked, and Jonah Hartman fell to the floor of his parlor, his blood soaking into the expensive carpet he'd bought with Matthew's gold. The man who'd murdered her husband, who'd stolen 9 years of her life, who'd slaughtered innocent families to protect his secret, was finally dead. Justice had been served. But somehow she didn't feel the satisfaction she'd expected. Instead, she felt empty, drained, as if something vital had been drained from her, along with Jonah's life. It's done, Thomas said quietly. Yes, she agreed, it's done. But even as she spoke the words, she knew it wasn't really over. There would be consequences for what they'd done tonight, questions that would need to be answered, explanations that would need to be given. And there was still the matter of the Spanish gold hidden somewhere in the cave system beneath Willow Creek. The treasure that had started this whole bloody chain of events, that had motivated Jonah's crimes and Matthew's death. What do we do now? She asked. Now we go home, Thomas said. And we decide what kind of life we want to build from the ashes of this one. As they rode away from Jonah's ranch, leaving behind the body of the man who'd haunted her dreams for 9 years, Eloise felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of knowing that justice had been served. The peace of knowing that the truth had finally been told. The peace of knowing that she was no longer alone in the world. The Apache warriors rode with her through the darkness, their presence a comfort and a promise. They'd stood with her in her quest for justice, had risked their own lives to help her find the truth about her husband's death. Now they were offering to help her build something new, something better, something that honored both Matthew's memory and their own hopes for the future. It was a gift more precious than any Spanish gold, more valuable than any treasure hidden in dark caves. It was the gift of family, of belonging, of purpose, and she was going to accept it. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after Jonah's death, when the morning mist still clung to the prairie grass and the world was caught between darkness and light. Eloise woke to the sound of gunfire and the thunder of hoofbeats. Through her bedroom window, she could see riders approaching from the east, their rifles glinting in the pale morning sun. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more, riding hard across the open ground with a disciplined formation of cavalry. But these weren't soldiers. These were vigilantes, armed civilians who'd taken the law into their own hands. And they were coming for her. "Tomas," she called out, grabbing her rifle and ammunition. "We've got company." The Apache warriors were already moving, their natural instincts for survival and warfare taking over. They'd been expecting this, had known that Jonah's death would bring retaliation, that the white community would demand justice for the killing of one of their own. "How many?" Tomas asked, appearing at her bedroom door. 20 at least," she replied. "Maybe more. They're armed for war." "Then we give them war," he said grimly. The ranch house had been built with defense in mind, a legacy of the Indian wars that had shaped the frontier. The walls were thick logs and the windows were narrow, and the doors were reinforced with iron bars. It wasn't a fortress, but it was better than nothing. The Apache warriors took their positions with the efficiency of men who'd fought desperate battles before. They knew how to use cover, how to conserve ammunition, how to make every shot count. But they also knew the mathematics of warfare, and the numbers weren't in their favor. "Mrs. Hartman," a voice called out from the approaching riders. "This is Deputy Marshal Crawford. You're under arrest for the murder of Jonah Hartman." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Someone had found Jonah's body, had connected it to her visit to his ranch, had organized this posse to bring her to justice. What evidence do you have?" she called back, stalling for time, while the Apache warriors finished their preparations. "We have witnesses who saw you at his ranch the night he died," Crawford replied. "We have your threats against his life. We have your association with these Apache killers." The charges were serious, but she knew they were also incomplete. The witnesses might have seen her at Jonah's ranch, but they hadn't seen the confrontation, hadn't heard his confession, hadn't witnessed the justice that had been served. "Jonah Hartman was a murderer," she shouted back. "He killed my husband and 7 Apache families. He stole gold and built his empire on blood money." "That's for a court to decide," Crawford replied. "Surrender now, and you'll get a fair trial." A fair trial. The words would have been laughable if they weren't so tragic. What kind of fair trial could an Apache-sympathizing widow expect in a territorial court? What kind of justice could she expect from a system that had failed to investigate Matthew's disappearance, that had ignored the massacre of innocent families, that had allowed Jonah to operate with impunity for 9 years? "I'll take my chances here," she called back. "Then you'll die here," Crawford replied. "All of you." The battle began with a fusillade of rifle fire that shattered the morning silence. The vigilantes had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the ranch house, using whatever cover they could find: fallen logs, drainage ditches, the ruins of an old shed. They poured bullets into the house with the methodical precision of men who'd done this before. But the Apache warriors were ready for them. They'd turned the ranch house into a fortress, had created firing positions that offered maximum protection while maintaining clear fields of fire. They returned the vigilantes' fire with deadly accuracy, dropping 2 men in the first exchange. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm, bursts of gunfire, followed by periods of tense silence, each side trying to conserve ammunition while seeking advantage. The vigilantes had numbers, but the Apache warriors had superior positions and better marksmanship. "We can't hold them forever," Thomas said, reloading his rifle. "They'll eventually rush us, and we don't have enough ammunition for a long siege." "Then we make them pay for every yard," Eloise replied, checking her own weapon. "We make them remember the cost of this fight." The words were brave, but she knew their situation was desperate. The vigilantes could afford to wait, could send for reinforcements, could starve them out if necessary. But the Apache warriors were fighting for their lives, and they wouldn't surrender. That's when she remembered Jonah's confession, his mention of the cave system beneath Willow Creek. If the caves were real, if they were accessible from her property, they might offer a way out of this trap. "The caves," she said suddenly. "Jonah mentioned caves beneath Willow Creek. Do you know about them?" "I know them," Thomas replied. "But they're dangerous. Easy to get lost, easy to get trapped. And if Jonah was telling the truth, they're full of bodies." "Better than being trapped here," she said. A bullet shattered the window beside her head, sending glass fragments across the floor. The vigilantes were getting bolder, moving closer to the house under the cover of their own gunfire. "We need to move now," Thomas said, "before they get close enough to rush us." The retreat was a nightmare of running and gunfire, of desperate sprints across open ground while bullets whined overhead. The Apache warriors covered each other's movements with disciplined fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. 2 of them didn't make it to the tree line. Bear, the gentle giant who'd been so patient with children, took a bullet in the chest and fell 50 yards from the house. Ciala, Anna, the woman who'd shared stories around the fire, was hit in the leg and couldn't keep up with the others. "Leave me," she gasped, clutching her wounded leg. "I'll slow you down." "Never," Thomas replied, lifting her onto his shoulders. "We all go together, or we don't go at all." The cave entrance was hidden behind a screen of willow branches, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. It was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it led to a larger chamber that extended deep into the earth. The smell hit them first, the stench of death of bodies that had been rotting in the darkness for years. Jonah hadn't been lying about using the caves as a burial ground. The evidence of his crimes was scattered throughout the chamber bones and clothing and personal effects that told the story of lives cut short. "My God," Eloise whispered, covering her nose with her hand. "How many people did he kill?" "More than we'll ever know," Thomas replied grimly. "But their deaths won't be in vain if we can use these caves to escape." The cave system extended deeper than any of them had imagined, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. The Apache warriors moved through the darkness with the sure-footed confidence of men who'd spent their lives in wild places, but even they were impressed by the complexity of the underground network. It was like a city beneath the prairie, carved by centuries of water flow and natural erosion. "This way," Thomas whispered, leading them deeper into the system. "There's another entrance about a mile downstream. If we can reach it, we can come up behind them." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the vigilantes maintained their siege of the empty ranch house, the Apache warriors would use the caves to outflank them, to turn the hunters into the hunted. It was a gamble, but it was better than dying, trapped in a house with no way out. They moved in single file through the narrow passages, their feet splashing through puddles of stagnant water that had collected in the low places. The bones of Jonah's victims littered the floor, a grim reminder of the man's cruelty and the price of his crimes. "Wait," Eloise said, stopping beside a pile of bones that looked different from the others. These aren't Apache. Thomas knelt beside the remains, his experienced eye taking in the details. White man, he confirmed. Tall, well-built. Been dead about 9 years. 9 years. The timeline fit perfectly with Matthew's disappearance. These were his remains, the bones of the husband she'd mourned for nearly a decade. Matthew, she whispered, reaching out to touch the skull that had once held the mind of the man she'd loved. I'm sorry, Thomas said quietly. I know this isn't how you wanted to find him. She knelt beside the bones, her fingers tracing the outline of the skull. It was strange how small death made everything, how the man who'd filled her life with laughter and dreams had been reduced to this pile of calcium and memory. But there was something else among the bones, something that glinted in the lamplight. She reached for it, her fingers closing around a small metal object. It was a locket, the one she'd given Matthew on their first anniversary. Inside was a tiny photograph of her taken on their wedding day. He'd been wearing it when he died, had carried her image with him into the darkness. He never stopped loving you, Thomas said, seeing the locket in her hands. I know, she replied, fastening the chain around her neck. And I never stopped loving him. The locket felt warm against her skin, a connection to the man who'd shared her dreams and died trying to protect them. It was a reminder that love didn't end with death, that some bonds transcended the grave. We need to keep moving, Thomas said gently. The others are waiting. They continued through the caves, following passages that seemed to wind endlessly through the earth. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with moisture and the smell of decay. But gradually, the passages began to slope upward, and they could feel fresh air beginning to flow through the tunnels. Almost there, Thomas said, pointing to a glimmer of light ahead. The exit is just around the next bend. They emerged from the caves into a grove of cottonwoods along Willow Creek, more than a mile from the ranch house. The vigilantes' gunfire was still audible in the distance. But it was sporadic now, the rhythm of men who were beginning to realize their quarry had escaped. They'll figure it out soon, Thomas said. We need to move fast. The counterattack was swift and merciless. The Apache warriors used the terrain to their advantage, moving through the tall grass and scattered trees like ghosts. They struck the vigilantes from behind, from the sides, from directions that should have been impossible. The vigilantes had been expecting a siege, a defensive battle where they could use their superior numbers to overwhelm their enemies. Instead, they found themselves fighting a mobile enemy who struck without warning and vanished before they could respond. What the hell? Crawford shouted, spinning around as one of his men fell with an Apache arrow in his chest. Where are they coming from? The answer came in the form of more arrows, more rifle shots, more men falling in the grass. The Apache warriors had turned, the tables had transformed the hunters into the hunted. Eloise watched from the tree line as the battle unfolded, her rifle ready, but her heart heavy. These men had come to arrest her, to drag her back to face justice for Jonah's death. But they'd also come to kill the Apache warriors who'd helped her to finish what Jonah had started 9 years ago. Mrs. Hartman. Crawford called out, his voice cracking with desperation. We can make a deal, surrender now, and we'll guarantee your safety. What about my friends? She called back. What guarantees do they get? They're murderers, Crawford replied. They killed a white man. There's no deals for murderers. The hypocrisy was staggering. These men were willing to negotiate with her to offer her mercy and protection, but they wanted to slaughter the Apache warriors who'd helped her find the truth about her husband's death. Then there's no deal, she said, raising her rifle. Her first shot took Crawford in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling into the grass. Her second shot scattered the men who'd been trying to rush her position. She wasn't a warrior like the Apache men, but she was a frontier woman who'd learned to shoot straight and shoot fast. The battle raged for another hour, but the outcome was never in doubt. The vigilantes had been caught off guard, had been outmaneuvered by an enemy who knew the terrain better than they did. One by one, they began to withdraw, dragging their wounded with them as they retreated toward town. "Let them go," Thomas said when Eloise started to pursue. "We've made our point." "They'll be back," she said. "With more men, more guns. This isn't over." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's not over. But we've bought ourselves time. Time to plan, time to prepare, time to decide what kind of future we want to build." As the dust settled over the battlefield, Eloise surveyed the cost of their victory. 2 of the Apache warriors had been wounded, but none killed. The vigilantes had lost at least 5 men, with several more wounded. It was a defeat that would be remembered, a warning to anyone who thought they could attack her ranch with impunity. But she knew Thomas was right. This was just the beginning. The territorial authorities would demand answers, would send investigators, would eventually mobilize enough force to overwhelm her defenses. She'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we dig up that Spanish gold," Thomas replied. "And we use it to buy ourselves the kind of justice that money can provide." The search for the treasure took 3 days, complicated by the need to remove Matthew's remains and give them a proper burial. They found the gold in a chamber deep beneath the main cave system, thousands of coins and bars that had been hidden by Spanish explorers centuries ago. It was more wealth than Eloise had ever imagined, enough to buy her own private army, enough to purchase influence in the territorial government, enough to transform her from a vulnerable widow into a woman of power and position. But it was also blood money, tainted by the crimes that had led to its discovery. Jonah had murdered for this treasure, had killed innocent families to protect his secret. Using it felt like honoring his memory, like profiting from his crimes. "Matthew would have wanted you to use it," Thomas said, seeing her hesitation. "Not for revenge, but for justice. Not for yourself, but for the people who need protection." He was right, she knew. The gold could fund a different kind of justice, but the kind that protected the innocent and punished the guilty. It could buy lawyers and judges, could purchase political influence, could create a sanctuary for people who had nowhere else to turn. "We'll need to be careful," she said. "The territorial government won't ignore this much wealth. They'll want to know where it came from." "Let them ask," Thomas replied. "We'll tell them the truth. We'll tell them about Jonah's crimes, about the murders he committed, about the treasure he died trying to claim. We'll let them decide whether they want to investigate further." The plan was audacious, but it was also necessary. They couldn't hide the gold forever, couldn't use it without attracting attention. Better to be open about its discovery, to control the narrative before someone else did. The territorial marshal arrived a week later, accompanied by a team of investigators and a squad of cavalry. Marshal Henry Dawson was a career lawman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd heard about the battle at Eloise's ranch, had come to investigate the claims and counterclaims that were flying around the territory. "A hell of a thing," he said, surveying the ranch house with its bullet-scarred walls and shattered windows. "Looks like you folks had quite a fight." "We defended ourselves," Eloise replied, "against men who came to murder us." "That's one way to look at it," Dawson said. "Another way is that you're harboring fugitives from justice, that you killed a prominent citizen, that you've been living outside the law." "Jonah Hartman was a murderer," she said firmly. "He killed my husband and 7 Apache families. He stole gold and built his empire on blood money." "You got proof of that?" Dawson asked. "I have his confession," she replied. "And I have this." She led him to the cave system, showed him the burial chamber where Jonah had hidden his victims. The evidence was overwhelming. Bones, personal effects weapons, everything needed to prove that Jonah had been a killer on a massive scale. "Jesus," Dawson whispered, surveying the carnage. "How many people did he kill?" "More than we'll ever know," Eloise replied. but enough to justify what we did to him. Dawson studied the evidence for a long time, his experienced eye taking in the details. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You know, there's been rumors about Jonah Hartman for years. Cattle rustling claimed jumping worse things. But nobody ever had proof. Nobody ever wanted to investigate too closely. Why not? Because he was useful, Dawson admitted. He kept the Apache quiet, kept the peace in his territory. The territorial government didn't want to rock the boat. Even if it meant ignoring murder. Especially if it meant ignoring murder, Dawson said grimly. Politics makes cowards of us all, Mrs. Hartman. Even those of us who should know better. The investigation continued for another week, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence against Jonah was overwhelming, and the territorial government was eager to distance itself from his crimes. Eloise was cleared of all charges, the Apache warriors were granted amnesty, and Jonah Hartman was posthumously indicted for multiple counts of murder. Of course, there's still the matter of this gold, Dawson said, examining the Spanish treasure. Technically, it belongs to the territorial government. Mineral rights, you know. Technically, it belongs to whoever finds it, Eloise replied. And we found it on my land. Your land that you purchased with stolen money, Dawson pointed out. On my land that I inherited from my murdered husband, she corrected. Money has nothing to do with it. The legal battle over the gold lasted 6 months, but Eloise had advantages that her opponents lacked. She had the best lawyers that money could buy, judges who were sympathetic to her cause, and a story that captured the public imagination. The widow who'd been wronged by her brother-in-law, who'd survived attacks by vigilantes, who'd uncovered a treasure that had been hidden for centuries. It was the kind of story that newspapers loved, the kind that made heroes out of ordinary people. In the end, she was allowed to keep the gold minus a substantial tax that went to the territorial government. It was enough to transform her from a struggling rancher into one of the wealthiest women in the territory. But wealth, she discovered, brought its own problems. Suddenly, she was courted by politicians and business leaders, invited to social events and charity functions, treated as a celebrity rather than a person. Everyone wanted something from her money, influence, endorsement for their causes. It's not what I expected, she confided to Thomas one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. What did you expect? He asked. Justice, she said simply. I thought that once the truth came out, once Jonah was exposed for what he was, everything would be better. But it's not. The Apache are still confined to reservations, white settlers are still taking their land, and the territorial government is still more interested in profit than justice. Then we use the gold to change that, Thomas said. We use it to buy the kind of justice that can't be purchased with bullets. Over the following months, Eloise used her wealth to fund a different kind of war. She hired lawyers to challenge illegal land seizures, funded schools for Apache children, provided medical care for families who couldn't afford it. She used her influence to pressure the territorial government to honor its treaties, to investigate corruption, to protect the rights of all citizens regardless of race. It was slow work, frustrating work, but it was also necessary work. The kind of justice that mattered couldn't be achieved with guns and gold alone. It required patience, persistence, and the willingness to fight battles that might not be won in a single lifetime. You're building something important, Thomas told her one day as they watched Apache children learning to read in the school she'd funded. Something that will outlast both of us. I'm trying, she said. But sometimes I wonder if it's enough. It's enough, he assured her. It's more than enough. The years passed, and Eloise's ranch became a symbol of something new in the territory, a place where Apache and white could live and work together, where justice was more important than profit, where the future was being built on hope rather than hatred. She never remarried, never had children of her own. but she became a mother to dozens of Apache children who had nowhere else to turn. She became a voice for the voiceless, a protector of the innocent, a woman who used her wealth and influence to make the world a better place. And every evening, as she sat on her porch and watched the sun set, she would touch the locket around her neck, the one that contained Matthew's photograph, and the one that reminded her of the love that had started this whole journey. He was still with her in a way, still guiding her decisions, still inspiring her to be better than she thought she could be. The man who died trying to build a better world had succeeded in ways he never could have imagined. "Thank you," she would whisper to the photograph, "for everything." And in the gathering darkness, with the Apache family settling in for the night around her, with the sound of children's laughter echoing across the prairie, she knew that Matthew would have been proud of what she'd built. It was justice, finally. Not the kind that came from a courtroom or a gun, but the kind that came from living a life that mattered, from using power to protect rather than to exploit, from building something that would outlast the hatred and fear that had shaped the frontier. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.